Chapter 2. Into the Darkness. Everything changes. It is one of the hardest things to accept in life, and yet the most inevitable. Things, and particularly people, can never stay the same, no matter how hard anyone tries. After the events described in the last few pages, the Stonewalls went back to regular life. They kept on winning games, losing a few now and then, and being proud to be Stonewalls. Tom wrote several unusual songs for them by putting new words to old classics, though most of them never got finished, and pretty soon even the parents knew the war cries and the secret codes, which were very rarely kept secret, and the special signals that the inventive little kids came up with during each new game. The Stonewalls were, for a brief time, invincible to all enemies. Then, an even more invincible power struck, with deadly results. The strange and unfeeling power of time, with its weapon of change. Time passed swiftly, and change followed in its wake. Like all things, the Stonewalls changed too. They grew. The immature little tykes got smarter and older. The short little boys grew up into tall young men. The girls blossomed into young women. With these changes came the passing of childhood traditions. One of the traditions to be lost was the habitual game of cops and robbers. Everyone now had the busy responsibilities of an older life to attend to, and such things as schoolwork ranked as more important than the playing of silly games. I'm making this up as I go. Sorry, I had to turn the page and I just decided to make up the end of the sentence. Let me try that again. Everyone now had the busy responsibilities of an older life to attend to, and such things as schoolwork ranked as more important than childlike enjoyments. None of them even had time to reminisce over the old days. The only person who still lived in the fond but fading past was Rose Brennan. She had grown too, and changed like the rest of them, but her spirit had lessened through the years, as her influence had waned, and slowly she'd grown dull and lazy, and even somewhat cowardly. She had grown up nicely enough, and her features could be considered attractive, but her face had lost its animation, and now, if one met her for the first time, they would style her listless and sullen, quite unlike the little girl she had once been. Her face had become pale and wan, and no sparkle remained in her now staring blue eyes. She still often dreamed of the past, remembering days when she'd been a wild little girl who would always lead the charge and be the last to retreat. Of course, a good many of the more self-glorifying memories she had to make up, since things like that had rarely really happened, but on the whole, she was deeply saddened by the thought that those happy old times would never come again. The children still saw each other almost every day, and were the best of friends, but now it seemed to Rose that they spent all of their free time doing more mature things, like debating over school subjects, or just sitting around and talking, and that ruled out any chance of being heroic or self-sacrificing. Gradually, Rose found herself more and more the lone leader of the littlest kids, losing touch with her old soldiers and comrades. As long as there were little kids around, whom she could tell about the good old days, when the Stonewalls were something worth noticing, she could console herself. In an attempt to keep the Stonewalls alive over the years, she had expanded their ranks to include the big boys, as well as the two now retired cops, and of course, Mrs. Brennan, who became the final Stonewall, number 14. Yet none of these new recruits, save for Mrs. Brennan, bothered to even remember what the Forgotten Club had been about. Rose always felt that something good could come of the Stonewalls, and she always hoped that perhaps something still might, but as yet nothing had, and the name was all she had to cling to and remember fondly. Such was the sorry state of affairs. Rose could not see what lay on the horizon. Oftentimes man is inclined to despair even at the very moment when the light of a new dawn appears, and Rose was no exception. For she, with all her Stonewalls, stood upon the threshold of a new beginning. This part of our story begins on a sunny spring day, about 7 years after the reader has seen our characters last. The place was a mountain road that led from the Brennan's house in their beautiful little county to a more bustling area of the cities beyond. The entirety of the Stonewalls, 14 strong, were crowded into the Brennans' only automobile. It was a unique vehicle, a black monstrosity in the form of a short-sitting bus, which had long ago been titled Sir Bounce-a-Lot in honor of its regal gait. Now it went rolling along, displaying a peculiar agility on the country road, zigzagging up and down the mountain terrain and through the towering trees. The day was hot, unusual for February, and as Sir Bounce-a-Lot boasted 12 seats with which to bear 14, the general mood was growing towards ill temper. A well-circulated flow of fresh air was quite lacking in the back of the car, and this was working dismal wonders on the dispositions all around. The slope and winding of the mountain road had begun to make those who weren't near the windows feel a little sick. "Do we have to go to this Shakespeare play thingy?" asked Mick Hogan loudly, running his hands through his dark hair and standing it up on end. Mick was now a fast-growing lad of 11, as full of strong opinions as ever before, yet now in complete command of the English language. "Don't you want to see a good play?" asked Carrie, who was now a remarkably lovely 15-year-old, with a gentle voice and beautiful chestnut hair. "Maybe they'll let us backstage if we behave ourselves." "If they did, maybe they could show us how to fight with fake swords," said Rose, "so we could look brave and heroic, but without really getting hurt or being scared." Mick shrugged. Rose had a point, but he supposed it would be just as good to fight with real swords as with fake. He thought about saying so, but decided against it, since Rose was a little ashamed of being such a scaredy cat, and he didn't care to hurt her feelings. "Swords are all right," he answered, "but that Shakespeare fella doesn't always stick to adventure, from all that Jim says. And I don't care to hear all the jargon about love and politics and all the rest of it. Why can't a play give us the excitement and have done with it?" "Pshaw, how young you must be," scorned Keith, glancing at Mick in disdain. "Real life isn't all excitement, so why should Shakespeare say that it is? I bet you can't name someone who gets mixed up in adventures and really exists." Mick opened his mouth to offer a retort, but then closed it again with an angry snap, for he knew only too well that he couldn't win in such banter against the merciless Keith. "A stone wall might," said Rose softly. "A what?" demanded Keith, turning in his seat to see Rose. "A stone wall? What are you talking about, Rose? Haven't seen any walls wandering off on adventures. Or is this something from one of the fairy tales you make up?" "Don't try to be funny, stupid. She didn't mean an actual wall," drawled Mick. "She's talking about that old club she made up, remember? She always says the stone walls are brave and get mixed up in adventures." Keith snorted. "Not real ones. Boy, Rose, you've got a brain like an elephant if you still remember all those silly games. I wish I had a memory like that. What do you eat? Say, what elephants eat, anyhow?" Rose glanced down and said nothing. It hurt bitterly to have her fondest memories so shamefully disregarded. Even Mick's attempt at her defense sounded crude and ungracious to her ears, yet she knew she could not redeem herself now. "They're not just silly games," cried Clump. "Rose makes up some neat stories, and they're not too weird, neither. Folks listen to things like Peter Pan and King Arthur, so why shouldn't they listen to her?" Clump was 10 years old now, and had grown only more beautiful with the passing years. She was as incorrigible as always, and to make matters worse, she had developed a love for all things daring, exciting, and dangerous. She was Rose's closest confidant at the time of this narrative, for she was always indeed a ready listener to Rose's yarns of the Stonewall days. "But folks put those books down when the story's over," said the matter-of-fact Kate, answering Clump because she happened to be sitting beside her. "They are all made up, after all." "Sure," said Keith. "They don't walk around thinking all that stuff is true. If they do, we lock 'em up in nut houses. Speaking of which, when was the last time you sailed off into an adventure, Clump?" Clump turned away with a growl, and Keith satisfied himself as having fired the parting shot. "Leave the girls alone, Keith," said Jim. "You know they aren't really serious. Lighten up and let them dream a little bit if they want." Keith straightened up. "Okay, Captain Serious," he bridled, "but you're one to talk. If there's anybody who doesn't believe in fairy tales around here, it's you, with all your high and mighty common sense." Jim didn't bother to reply, returning to his calm study of the passing scenery. Still, Rose said nothing, though the conversation broached matters closest to her heart. Jim's defense was no comfort, for Keith was right in saying that he was likely the most practical of the lot. She knew well enough that her poetic philosophies wouldn't stand a chance against such sensible companions, particularly Keith while he was feeling witty. It was indeed the bitter truth, as Kate had said, that all her grand ideals would wither and vanish at the closing of a book, and never stand the mocking test of real life. "I think there really is adventure," observed Carrie thoughtfully, and Rose raised her head hopefully. "I think it just has to be found in the everyday things, not the way we imagine fairy tales. Going to see a play is almost an adventure." Rose couldn't help but sigh. Clump groaned aloud. "I like all the romance that Rose is always harping on," said Neve. "She sounds like she's remembering things that never happened to us, and I think— Mom, look out!" Whatever it was that Neve thought was then forgotten, and it is likely she has never yet finished the observation she began that day. As they came swiftly round a sharp bend, another automobile appeared out of nowhere, as it seemed. Mom swerved quickly aside, lest they crash head-on into the other car. They were quite near the perilous edge of the mountain road, and the terrain fell away just beyond them, plummeting down at a frightful slope of the mountainside. Under Mom's quick hand, they pulled aside, and the oncoming car swept by them with a speed that made Sir Bouncelot sway where he stood. The brink of the slope lay almost beneath their front wheel, and it seemed that if Mom had halted just an instant later, they would have tipped clear over the edge. For a moment, Sir Bouncelot sat quite still, and all was silent within. Then Mom loosened her grip upon the wheel. "Boy, that car almost hit us," exclaimed Luke, who held the honored privilege of sitting in the front passenger seat. Mom smiled bravely. "But it didn't, and a miss is as good as a mile." "That's the third time today," muttered Neve, "if you count how that kitchen shelf almost fell down on top of Rose, and how she got tripped up on the basement stairs." "Rose, you're jinxing us," said Keith, who alone had paid attention to Neve's muttering. "None of my business if it's your day to go, but you don't have to take us with you." "Shut up, Keith," said Jim. "It isn't funny. That was too near a miss." He glanced darkly out his window, gazing down the steep slope that lay just outside. As he spoke, Mom backed up and set them slowly rolling once again as Sir Bouncelot pulled away from the perilous edge of the road. "What would have happened if we'd gone off the cliff?" asked Clump complacently, as they began to gather speed once more. "Would we have blown up at the bottom?" "Ooh, don't even think about things like that," said Carrie with a shudder. "I sort of wish we had, so I could see what would have happened," mused Clump. "Now I know you're batty," said Keith. "That's what comes from believing in fairy tales." Suddenly, Mom gave a cry and brought Sir Bouncelot to a screeching halt. The children who were seated more precariously were almost knocked from their seats, many with a sharp adjective in regard to their neighbors' brains. "What is that?" Mom said aloud. "What is what?" asked Neve, straightening up quickly at the tone in her mother's voice. "Look," answered Luke. He pointed out the windshield, and the book he had been reading slid unnoticed from his lap. All eyes turned where he pointed, and the annoyed clamor died on the speaker's lips. It's a cloud," said Carrie hesitantly. "In the middle of the road?" asked Kate. She appeared to be right. In the center of the road, only about 10 feet in front of them, there lay a dark cloud. It hovered over the center of the road, and only reached to the tops of the trees that drooped overhead across the narrow highway. The color of the cloud was an unearthly black, and it slowly swirled within itself as though stirred by a soft wind. "This is really weird," muttered Mick. "You're telling me," nodded Luke. "What are you going to do, Mrs. Brennan?" "I could put on the lights and drive into it," said Mom. "Maybe it's just a heavy fog that'll lift once we go through it." "I hope so," muttered Carrie. "I don't," said Clump suddenly, tossing her chin in Keith's direction. "I want some adventure first." Rose glanced at Clump, and then turned her gaze out upon the strange shadow in the road. A cold dread gripped her heart. "Not right now," she said quickly, in answer to Clump's declaration. Clump looked up at her in surprise and disappointment. Rose gave her little friend a frightened glance and endeavored to explain. "I want adventure too, but not right now," she said. "I'm a little scared of that dark cloud." "Situation normal," muttered Hank under his breath to Tom. Tom nodded. At times, Rose annoyed them with her newfound cowardice. Neither of the two boys had changed much since their younger days, save in height, and they didn't see why Rose would have cause to change either. "All right, then," said Jim, leaning forward in his seat. "We can't stay here all day. Someone might come along and think we're in trouble." "Aren't we?" asked Kate. "Say," said little Bridie, who had knelt up on her seat and was looking out the back window. "Here comes a car now. Let's see what they do." They watched in silence as another car sped up and swerved quickly around them. For an instant, Mom glimpsed the driver casting an annoyed glance toward them, as though he wondered why they were stopped, but his automobile did not slow, and he vanished suddenly into the cloud before them. "He looked like he didn't see anything unusual," cried Carrie. "He didn't even slow down." "Well, we can't all be seeing things," said Tom soberly, "'cause I hope I'd hallucinate more interesting things than some of you." He pulled the pair of spectacles from his nose and stared stolidly ahead. Hank looked at him and grinned, for Tom, to all intents and purposes, was quite blind without his glasses. "That answers it," nodded Tom, returning the glasses to their place. "We aren't seeing things." "How do you figure that?" asked Hank. "I can't see that cloud without my glasses," said Tom, "and I figure even my eyes aren't so bad as to need glasses for a hallucination." "Well," said Mom, "maybe that other driver was just not worried by a little fog. He seemed to get through it all right, so we might as well give it a try." Sir Bouncelot lurched into motion again, but if anyone was dislodged this time, not a sound was made. A strange foreboding grew upon all. Perhaps it was their recent fright, or perhaps a premonition of what lay ahead, but it could not be denied that a tingling suspense settled over them as they approached the mysterious darkness. Then, with a suddenness that made everyone gasp, Mom and Luke, in the driver's and passenger seats, suddenly seemed to disappear. Utter darkness had taken their place. To those squeezed in the very back seats, this strange phenomenon occurred to everybody in front of them. At last, those in the back were suddenly hit with the feeling that they had gone utterly blind. They couldn't see their hands held an inch from their frightened faces. Rose began to whimper, as though she would burst into tears at any moment. Even Clump began to feel a little nervous. "Well," said Mom as she pulled the car to a stop, "I certainly can't keep driving in this darkness. I'll hit something." "Are we going to just wait here, then?" asked Jenny's gentle voice through the blackness. "What if another car comes along and hits us?" "Perhaps I'll just try to back up," said Mom, "and head back towards the light." "It's gone!" cried Hank, and they heard him turning in his seat towards the back window. "What?" cried all of them at once. "The light! It's gone behind us! It's like there never was any!" "All right, everybody," said Luke hurriedly. "Now we just have to remember, don't panic." "Who's panicking?" asked Kate. "I feel like I'm gonna be sick." "I'm scared," cried Rose. "Let's go." "Go where?" asked Hank. "Just drive. We're bound to get somewhere." "Sure, to hit a tree," came Tom's cheerful voice. "Well, are we just gonna sit here for the rest of our lives?" asked Jim. In answer to his question, the car suddenly lurched and swayed precariously. They were jolted violently, and one of the girls gave a little shriek. "Put the brake on!" cried Luke. "You've got us near the edge again." "It is on!" cried Mom. "I can feel it." "Then why are we rolling?" demanded Luke. Before Mom could answer, there was a sudden plunge, and the whole car seemed turned upside down. Several of them indeed felt their heads hit the roof and immediately started howling, while the rest shrieked and hollered for the sheer terror of it all, as the darkness became a whirlpool of dizziness and pain. Then, quite as suddenly as it had started, the rolling stopped. Vaguely they could sense that they were much lower down than they had been before. "Is everyone all right?" asked Mom. "I think I left my stomach at the top of the hill," said Kate. Hank laughed shakily. "Well, at least we're all safe," said Mom. "Safe nothing," moaned Tom. "I smashed my head into somebody, and I'm seeing so many stars I feel like an astronut." "I think I got my wish, and we rolled down the cliff," cried Clump. "That's impossible. We'd be dead," protested Keith. "Maybe we are," returned Clump defiantly. "Look, it's getting lighter out," cried Brighty suddenly. "I can see Clump." "Good, then get off of me," said Clump, shoving her friend back onto her half of the seat. "It is getting lighter," said Mom. "Maybe we can see how far we rolled and if it's possible to get back on the road." As she spoke, the darkness around them lifted. It seemed to have penetrated into their very bones, and they saw with surprise that the day outside was much dimmer than it had been. Yet even in the sudden dimness they were blinded for a moment by the light, for the fog vanished rapidly. And as their eyes grew accustomed to the light, they also grew round with amazement and shock. Carrie gasped aloud. "Where are we?" faltered Luke. "Nowhere that I've ever seen before," answered Mom quietly. "And this certainly isn't California." Out the windows, all that could be seen were huge, dark trees growing close together. They crowded close around the car, for it seemed they were located in the only small patch of open space in the vicinity. The ground that could be seen was covered with deep, dark green moss, and strange growths sprouted from the bark of the trees. Luke opened his door. The air that came in was stuffy, stagnant, and oppressive. A smell of decay overpowered all other scents and made them feel sick. Cautiously, Luke slid out of his seat and put one foot down on the dark moss. The moss gave way until most of his foot was out of sight within its deep, spongy surface. "It's okay, there's hard ground under here," he said after a moment. "I think you all can get out." Jim opened his door at his friend's suggestion and stepped out bravely. The others followed his example, and as they emerged and came into the heavy atmosphere, their feelings of foreboding grew. As far as the eye could see, there were only more dark trees. The sky above them, at least what little they could see through the dense treetops, was clouded and gloomy. The woods round them were close and stifling, and they couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. "I don't like this place," said Jenny quietly. "Stay close to Sir Bouncelot, kids," said Mom. "In fact, I think we should get back in and lock up. I don't want any of you getting lost here." She muttered softly, "Wherever here is." "How did we even get here?" asked Luke. "This couldn't be some dark gully next to the canyon that we rolled into, could it?" "It sure doesn't look like it," said Jim. "And all this doesn't make any more sense than that car almost hitting us or a cloud sitting in the middle of the road. What do you suppose is the reasonable explanation behind it all? Why are we here?" Rose was still fearfully crouched in Sir Bouncelot, not yet having had the nerve to get out. She gazed around in unthinking fear, and heard Jim's subdued comment. Then she spoke herself, almost without realizing she did, and stuck one tentative foot out of the car and down toward the moss. "Why are we here?" she repeated. "Why am I here?" She set her foot down on the ground and straightened up. Suddenly, there came a deafening clap of thunder, which seemed to fall down upon them out of the heavens above. The trees shook. As it broke upon their ears, a strange tremor ran across the ground under their feet. The sudden cry of some strange bird rang through the dark trees. This mysterious commotion of the elements was the last straw. It struck upon their taut nerves with a dangerous suddenness and wreaked havoc in its wake. Rose screamed, and like an idiot, she bolted. "Rose, stop!" cried Mom. But even she was too late, for the rest followed Rose's example. A sudden, blinding fear seemed to have taken hold of the children, and it defied any usual sense they might possess. They ran away, heedless, as though scattered by a violent wind. Even Keith and Neve sprang forward, perhaps convincing themselves that they were trying to be of help in the sudden disorder, though they knew deep down that this strange fear forced them to move whether they wanted to or not. Mom, not disarmed for a moment, sprang into action quickly. She reached out and caught Neve by the arm in a firm grip, arresting her panicked flight, and as Keith was fleeing past her in the same general direction, she deftly stuck out her foot and tripped him up. "Rose! Hank!" she cried sternly, even as she successfully brought the two once-and-future cops to their ignominious halts. "Stop, and come back here!" She called out the two names that were closest to her immediate thought, and the ringing command in her voice worked wonders on all who had the wits to listen. Carrie and a few others stopped instantly, as though they had been struck, and hesitated a moment, wondering what had come over them. Mom took advantage of the momentary silence to give prompt orders. She saw Hank walking swiftly back through the trees towards them, having heard and obeyed her call and recovered himself more quickly than his companions. But there were some, including Rose, who were nowhere to be seen. Mom turned to Luke and Jim, for though they hadn't had the sense to help, they had stood their ground quite bravely by comparison. "Luke, go off past those bushes over there," ordered Mom quietly, pointing out the direction, "and get after Clump. She went that way and was dragging Bridie with her." "Yes'm," said Luke, and he dashed off after the two little girls. "I saw where Mick went," offered Jim, "and I think I can catch him." "Good," said Mom. "Get after him." She hurried to collect her scattered Stonewalls, who were now returning to the car with nervous expressions of apprehension and apology. Mom gave them a reassuring smile, which said more than any words. They huddled close around her by the car doors, and her professional eye scanned them quickly. Keith was raising himself from all fours, where he had landed, thanks to Mom's quick action, and even he began offering his sheepish help as Hank returned to the party. "Boy, that was strange," Hank was muttering. "I don't know what came over me. Thanks for calling me, Mrs. Brennan, or I'd likely be running yet." "You're a good boy, Hank," answered Mom, "and you can think quickly. We've got some trouble, and I need your help. All of you, get into the car and stay put, except for Neve, Keith, Carrie, and Hank." Mom spoke from habit, accustomed to handling a crowd. In this instance, all of you meant only Kate and Jenny. They obeyed, quickly, greatly comforted by Mom's command of the situation. They took their seats in the vacant car, very quietly and promptly, in sharp contrast to the commotion that typically reigned over those seats. A sense of their losses was silently impressed upon all. Mom turned to her 4 chosen aides. "Now I trust the 4 of you to keep your heads," she said, with the air of a quarterback outlining a play. "I don't want you going off alone. Neve and Keith, you two go together, out that way, and Hank and Carrie will go in the opposite direction. As soon as you find someone, come back here immediately. One more thing. Leave yourself a trail to follow back so you won't get lost yourselves. Break a twig and leave it hanging, or leave a token behind as a landmark. Now get moving." 4 heads nodded humble assent, and they turned away to their respective routes. Each felt quite inadequate to the present emergency, but Mom was not a leader to accept timidity, and they bolstered their spirits obediently. As they vanished from sight, Mom turned to Kate and Jenny. "Don't move from your seats, either of you," she ordered. "Keep yourselves locked in, and don't open up unless you're positive you're opening up to one of us. And say a prayer, girls, while you're waiting. I'm going out to look for Rose." The smile she gave them was softer than her commands, and she left them comforted. Without a glance back, she set forth through the dark trees, whispering as she did so an ardent prayer of her own.